Good evening, everyone. Glad you could join us tonight for lesson 19 of our series called The Heart of the Matter. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the Christian's attitude toward husbands. The last four lessons that we are now looking at the end of this series, the one we did last Sunday night on marriage, tonight on husbands, this coming Sunday night on wives, and then on children the following Wednesday evening. These last four lessons are focusing on family. And it is so vitally important that we have the right attitudes toward our role in the family and the relationships that we sustain with others in the family. And one of the great challenges of this, of course, is that our society has been determined to alter or outright attack these roles and responsibilities, the place in the family that each would hold as a parent, child, or husband or a wife. Our society has been attacking these notions now for decades. And I'm afraid that the messages and the attack have become successful. We're seeing in our own day and time a crisis in families, a crisis in marriages, people putting the Bible aside and trying to feel their way along through these difficult challenges of family on their own without divine guidance, or listening to the latest psychological views of what men and women should be, or modern ideas of how a marriage should be constructed. And so we've witnessed this attack on the roles of men and women. Of late, we've been observing an attack on masculinity itself relative to the lesson tonight on husbands. And so now we are seeing the whole concept of masculinity really being denied and undermined. The whole notion of what makes a man is something that our modern culture is sweeping aside in the interest of egalitarianism, that all should be the same, that there should be no distinctions and no differences, and certainly no hierarchy. And what's happening is the families and marriages of our nation are suffering. And we're paying an extremely high price for this in terms of economics, in terms of psychological well-being, in terms of the divorces that are taking place and the dissolution of families and all of the damage that wreaks upon the minds of vulnerable children. So we need to instill these concepts in our children, we who believe in God and believe in His Word and believe that the architecture that is set forth for us in the New Testament of what makes a man a husband and a woman a wife, and then how that family interacts together and what its organizational structure is. We who believe that originates with God and is described in Scripture, we need to reinforce these messages. We need to practice them ourselves, and we need to teach these things to our children, because they're not going to get it in school. They're not going to get it from the popular messaging of our society. In fact, they're going to get quite the opposite. So I believe these last four lessons are of crucial importance to us as Christians and for the sake of our nation and the well-being of our society in general. I began this lesson with a quote from LaGard Smith's book, Male Spiritual Leadership. And in this quote, he's talking about the importance of each understanding their role within an organization. This organization we're thinking about, of course, is the family. But the division of labor, who does what, who has authority, who is handling which elements of the family duties and responsibilities that need to be done every day. And so LaGard Smith says, in situations of shared power, there can be balance, cooperation, and mutual consideration. Yet political scientists would recognize in a union of shared power that principle, that interdependence erodes the autonomous government's ability to act independently. The rest of us are more likely to recognize the fact that doubles tennis gives you twice the number of players per side, but also opens up the possibility of letting the ball whiz through the center of the court while the partners give the classic, "I thought you were going to get it" looks to each other. Recognize roles always puts the ball of responsibility in the right court. And I think that's a good observation about how the family is to be constructed. We give up independence as in this case, a man, a husband, and potentially a father. We give up the independence that we could have sought for ourselves, the things that we could have done for ourselves in life. We give that up to belong to an organization that is our family. And when we do that and we realize what that family requires, there's got to be cooperation between a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, to see that everything that needs to be done in a family gets done. And they're very important things to be done. I think this is all the more true in our society today, which is so complex, so filled with options and choices. We are all overrun with life itself. Now, granted, life has slowed down probably for most of us because of the COVID crisis, and maybe that's helping us learn a few things about perhaps how overly complicated our lives have gotten. But there's a lot going on, even in times of crisis like we're in now. There's a lot that needs to happen for a family to function together properly. And that's only going to happen if husbands and wives and mothers and fathers are on the same page and they understand who is responsible for which realm of family activity, family responsibility. So let's begin with the first point here of, I called this understanding men, and I sort of said tongue in cheek that this won't be a long part of the lesson because we men probably don't understand ourselves any more than we would maybe claim to understand women. The truth of the matter is we're all complex. Men are complex creatures, and it's easy for women to kind of scratch their heads and look at men and wonder where in the world, we're coming from. And we men tend to look at our wives or other women and scratch our heads and say, I just don't understand what they're thinking. I don't know why they did so and so. I don't feel that in my life, or I don't think that's important. And what we're doing basically is admitting the differences between men and women. Simple observation, point A1 here. Simple observation reveals that there are profound differences between the sexes that cannot be legislated away. Now, that's not just a Christian talking from the Bible. That is the result of many, many psychological studies that have been done with the intent, probably, of demonstrating that there is really no difference at all in men and women inherently, and the differences are merely social. They're conditioned. And yet, I think what's being found in these studies is something quite different. There are intrinsic differences between males and females. Yet, certain voices insist that gender is not genetically determined, but merely a cultural construct. That's the new way of looking at gender today. Gender is just social construct. We teach a young man or a boy to be this kind of a male. We instill certain, they would say, undesirable principles in females to make them feminine. And of course, it's not just the radical academics that believe this. This is the main cultural message of our day, is that any assumption of difference is backward thinking, is really a form of abuse, that we should teach really a boy to almost to be gender neutral and a young woman the same. And so there's a push to make a boy play with dolls and give girls sports equipment and whatnot, which in and of themselves, those are not, they're not particularly damaging. Children should play with all kinds of toys and pretend to be all kinds of different people. But there's an insidiousness in this particular thrust today, and that is the overt attempt to make a boy feminine or perhaps to make a girl masculine. And this is so completely misguided in our day and time. So plain horse sense, which I say is judgment, good judgment, shorn of cultural baggage and psychobabble, recognizes that replacing a boy's trucks with a tutu, as it were, won't really change his inherent maleness. This is the faulty thinking of gender being cultural. Well, if you just train a boy to be more feminine, he'll be more feminine. A boy raised with a feminine emphasis merely becomes a feminized male. It is fantasy to think that you can teach a child to be neutral in regard to gender and then just sort of let them drift around and find their own gender later in life. That is a tragedy, and that is a miscarriage of parental responsibility. It is an abdication of what our responsibility is as parents, to teach our boys to be men, grow up to become men, and accept and embrace their masculinity and the role that God has given them in a marriage and in the family, and teach a young lady to do the same thing. Embrace the God-given distinctions of male and female, and embrace her role as a wife and a mother. This is something that simply cannot be educated out of people entirely. You may be able to mold and shape certain people in society to act in certain ways, but I would submit that one's true sexuality, male or female, is so powerful, it is going to come out in the end. You cannot just teach that away. And so allowing for individual differences. We're not trying to say here that all men are this and all women are that. Allowing for individual differences. God equips males to function in the unique role for which he made them. I think that is true across gender. That is, generally speaking, God endows males with the kind of character traits, the kind of innate qualities that enable them to do the job God gave them. And the same thing for young women. This lesson focuses on men. But I believe that that's true across the board. And what I mean by that is God has always equipped men and women to do what he's asked them to do. God never gives us an assignment and then leaves us adrift and unprepared and unresourced to do that thing. And so, again, there are some men that have more feminine type traits to them. There are some women that enjoy activities or maybe in their carriage are a little bit more masculine than others. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just part of the natural difference that exists from individual to individual. These are just common variances that we experience as human beings. But in general, God has entrusted the man to lead in the family, lead in the church, and generally, though not absolutely, to lead in society. Men are generally then physically stronger than women. They're less emotional, generally speaking. They're more logical. They're more task-oriented. And, you know, these are things that women sometimes complain about in regard to men. They're competitive. They're goal-oriented. They're driven. They're not soft, perhaps, in their feelings. They don't express their feelings. They don't talk as much, perhaps, as a woman would like them to talk. And so these end up becoming qualities that enable a man to, if you will, forge ahead and achieve goals for his family and work hard and diligently and not be easily put off by emotions. These are all elements that enable a man to do what God has given to him. And yet sometimes tongue in cheek, sometimes more seriously, women, again, not understanding men, might complain about these very things that God has endowed most men with to equip them to do their job. And so one of the points we'll be making in these lessons is it is very important for each of the sexes to try to understand the others and to accept that there are differences, and not just criticize the difference in one's mate, but work to understand, why does my husband think that way? Why does he do that? Why doesn't he feel this? I feel this. I think this is what ought to be done. I don't know why he doesn't do so-and-so. And instead of that mindset, understand that God does create differences between us, and they are innate. And then try to understand that and get inside the head, if you will, of your husband. Now, this works in reverse as well, to understand our wives. But these differences, being inherent, are very important to the blending together of these two as one flesh, and discharging the various responsibilities that are given to us in our families. And so there are individual differences in these traits. Not all men are exactly the same in regard to them, but generally speaking, men are equipped for the job God has given to them. Now, we can haggle over the various individual traits. We can cite, women who've excelled in the man's world, and there are women who now are serving in the military that do a lot of strenuous sports activities, that serve in Congress and other high offices in the land and are CEOs of companies. We grant all of that women can excel, if you will, in the man's world. Or we can talk about the house husband, the man who stays home and cares for the children and runs the house while the woman is working. At the end of the day, still, men are going to be men with their peculiar traits, and women are still going to be women. And if we don't work to understand the other, then it doesn't matter how economically successful or how powerful one may be over the other. That matters nothing compared to whether the family is going to operate properly, and whether there's clearly defined boundaries, and whether there's unity and camaraderie between the two. Those are all things that are really going to be brought into full bloom by understanding the differences of the roles and responsibilities in the family. If we continue to deny the obvious, which we're pretty well doing as a culture, we're denying things that are genetically obvious and true and factual. We will foment misunderstandings between the sexes, and we won't understand why we don't get along, why these differences exist. When you keep fighting against, I'll say nature, but you fight against the creative nature that God has put within us. You keep butting your head against that wall because you believe in egalitarianism, and you believe that men and women should be interchangeable parts, and you believe that there's no difference between males and females, and you keep butting your head up against that wall. Those differences are still going to be there. And you're not going to understand why you can't figure the other one out, or why this doesn't work out according to, the calculations you drew up on your social slide rule. The fact of the matter is, if we're not in harmony with our created being, that is the nature God has put within us, if we don't seek to understand that, and many today in our society are not, then we're going to be frustrated and we're going to be at odds with each other. So point C under number one goal of any wife. Now remember, this works in reverse, but we're talking about husbands tonight. One goal of any wife should be to understand the traits of men in general and familiarize herself with those personality traits embodied in her husband. So two different things there. For a woman, for especially a wife, or maybe a would-be wife and a mother, to understand what does it mean to be male? What does that actually mean? What does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean for my husband to be the leader God wants him to be? And then secondarily, let me understand my husband. Because not all men, as we've said, fit into one clear-cut characterization of maleness. There are variations among men. There are variations among women. And so let me understand men as best I can and what makes them tick. I mean, after all, if we can characterize men, in general terms, we're admitting that there are things that are characteristic of men, or nobody would get the joke. So we're acknowledging that there are certain things that make masculinity masculinity. A woman needs to try to understand what that is, and then understand her husband's idiosyncrasies, his individual characteristics, so that in that understanding, she is in a more secure place and she has wisdom in how to deal with that relationship. She will help herself immensely, and she will help her husband as he seeks to fulfill his role in the family. Happiness depends on securing and understanding with each other, and an understanding of roles in the family. And the more understanding we have, the happier that family relationship will be. So let's move on to point number 2, talk about understanding the male's role a little bit more, a woman's potential discomfort. And it has been bred in our society by women's liberation movements. The potential discomfort a woman may feel in being in a subordinate and dependent role is understandable, especially in our culture, because it is in our culture more possible for a woman to be independent and to provide for herself. In more primitive societies where life is hard, physically eked out of the land, if you will, dependence upon a male is pronounced. We talk about that when studying in the Bible and Bible times, and how difficult it was to be a widow in an agricultural and farming type society. The work was very hard and very physical, and required great strength. And a woman without a husband and or a son was a woman in dire straits. And so that dependence on a man sort of was forced by the circumstances. Societies today, which are more violent and chaotic, place a premium upon the power of a man to protect his wife and protect his family. But in the U.S., ease of living, high wages, educational opportunities for women, relative peace in our society enhance a woman's independence. So I understand, much as I can, being a man, I understand the trepidation a woman may feel in placing herself in a position of dependence and submission. Now, some of these things are things we talked about last Sunday evening. So there's not a lot of scripture in this lesson. This is more about applications of things that we talked about from Ephesians 5 last Sunday evening. But be that as it may, I can understand how a woman would feel this anxiety over being in a dependent role when our society allows her more independence and praises her independence. The need for a man may not be quite so obvious when a woman has a college degree, a master's degree. She might have very high earning potential. She lives in a fairly safe societal environment. Life is not so difficult. If you can't do it yourself, you can usually pay to have it done in our day and time. It does not require physical masculine strength, I'm saying, in order to survive like it would have been in more primitive times. Modern Western culture considers it demeaning and depersonalizing for a woman to have a high level of dependence on a man. This is ridiculed today. When we start trying to even read or talk about Ephesians 5, in our culture today, why, it's laughable. It is despised. We are thought to be primitive cavemen, to be talking about the husband as head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church. That a woman is to be in submission to her husband in all things. Such views from liberal philosophy and academia today have trickled down to the woman on the street and are reinforced by the cultural media. Men have been portrayed for a long time on television and in movies, but portrayed as bumbling idiots or overbearing autocrats, while women are intelligent and insightful and innovative, capable of deftly balancing motherhood and career. Women are portrayed by and large of having it all together. If you're watching television and a commercial comes on and it's got a male-female component to it, the man is always the idiot. The woman always has it together. I have seen a few exceptions to that motif, but more often than not, on television, whether it's commercials or longer programming, men are portrayed as generally incompetent boobs. And this has been hammered in and hammered in and hammered in by Hollywood for so long that it's now just part of the cultural fabric. The idea that a woman should be in any way submissive to her husband, not completely equal, which is what egalitarian means. If any suggestion that she is not completely equal, if not a little above him, is anathema. That's just something that's a discussion that cannot be had in our society. And so a writing like Ephesians 5, Paul is denounced as a male chauvinist, that it's backward, it's culturally irrelevant to today, it is Neanderthal. There's absolutely no way a woman should ever accept any role that puts her in any kind of submission to a man. So in this role revisionism, males have taken a serious hit. Not only has a woman's perception of a man's role been affected, in many cases, men have become confused as well. They've had it pounded into them so long that they've got no right whatsoever to direct his wife in a family situation, that he's got no right to make decisions, that everything must be absolutely, completely equal. And of course, it goes even beyond that. Now in our time, men are so confused as to how to even approach a woman because of the fear of being labeled misogynistic or not respectful of a woman. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know how to ask a woman out for a date. He doesn't know how to speak, tell a joke or speak to a woman in such a way that she doesn't accuse him to HR. I mean, we are in a mess. Culturally, we are in a mess because we don't want to honor the roles that God has laid out for men and women in relationships and in marriage, especially in the family. And so this isn't a problem just about women being confused. It's a problem about men being confused. And it really multiplies itself when our young boys are not being taught clearly by their parents what it means to be a boy. And then as he grows up and develops, what it means to be a teenage boy, and then what it means to be a young man, and what it means to be a husband, and what it means to be a father. Oh, that's off limits too in our society. That's indoctrinating your children. That's child abuse. Well, you know what? At the risk of being labeled child abusers, we need to teach what the Bible says about these things. We need to teach our young men to be men, to be males. I know this is not politically correct, but you know what? If you're not going to hear it here, you're not going to hear it, because you're not going to hear this in the Washington Post, and you're not going to hear it on the Ellen DeGeneres show or any of these other idiotic talk shows that are on during the daytime. You're not going to read this in the public popular literature of the day. This is not politically correct. But as Christians, we need to teach this to our children, because our families and our marriages and our maleness is being undermined by certain special interest groups. So godly husbands and wives should cultivate an appreciation for the leadership God has invested in the husband. In Ephesians chapter 5, in verse 33, Paul there says that a wife should see that she respects her husband. So we're thinking about attitudes toward husbands. I don't know that there's any greater one that would help bolster a husband's confidence and create loving appreciation from between the two than for a wife to respect her husband and support him and encourage him and state her appreciation for him, and verbally and otherwise. And so this idea of giving respect for the man's role of being the leader in the family, this is what brings order and initiative and direction to the family. And a man needs to be supported in that. And we'll talk about that in one of our questions further down. But in any other organization of people, leadership must be clearly focused for maximum productivity. Again, thinking about our quote from LaGard Smith earlier, if we're going to have an organization, if we're going to have a multitude of people working together to accomplish a particular goal, there's got to be focus and there's got to be division of labor. There's got to be clarity of how the whole mechanism works with different people being involved. Someone must take responsibility for setting a tone, overseeing the whole, providing cohesiveness in the community. In this case, the community being the family. And Paul talks about that in Ephesians 5, that husbands are to be the head of the family. And so that's fleshed out somewhat in Ephesians 5. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5, that context has to do with a man later in life being qualified to be an elder. But one of the qualities must be that he rules his own house well. And that's not something that you start in your 40s. It's something that you must have been doing all along in order for your family to be intact and together and spiritually healthy, and that you have a voice of authority in your family. It's something that needs to be cultivated and done all the way through. Now, in this regard, the Bible does not assert a man's moral or intellectual superiority in being the leader. I don't know of any passage in Scripture that says men should lead because they're smarter than women. Or I've placed men in a leadership role because they just are inherently more spiritual and moral than women. No, that is not the case at all. And we talked about this in our last lesson. But there's nothing inherent here. Men are not inherently more wise than women. Men are not inherently more intellectual than women. It's simply according to God's creative order. God made Adam first, and he made him the leader and the head. And then he made Eve because God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. We said that's not an afterthought. God didn't say, oops, I didn't quite get that right. Let me now make up for that by making a woman. God is not foolish and lacking in foresight. God deliberately made the man first and the male as a helper comparable to the man in order to create a unity of two working together, coming together as one flesh in a marital relationship, but being different components. They're inherently different, but you bring a man and a woman together in those differences and they blend together and even that out in love for one another, in working together and in unity and in pursuing spiritual goals and having godly character. And you see this wonderful oneness or unity or one flesh, as it's called. You see this organism, a unified organism being created out of two people. That won't happen if you've got two people fighting each other. Two people that are so the same that they can't blend together. As we say in our common vernacular, opposites attract. How often have you seen that in marriages? She's outgoing, he's quiet, or vice versa. She's skilled in economic and financial affairs, and he couldn't hold on to a nickel if he had to. There are differences between men and women, some inherent and some developed along the way. But those differences blend together and create one unified whole. There's no assumption here that men are just better than women, therefore God made them the leaders. That is just simply not biblical. It does flow out of God's creative order, and that's something that he chose. And if we don't like that, I suppose we can take that up with him. I don't think arguing with God is going to get us very far, though. We're not smarter than God. We think we are, but we're not smarter than God. God put this together as he did for a reason. And so, to be fair, I mean, there are some men that buy into this. Well, I'm superior. That's why God made me the leader. And then he holds that over his wife. He badgers her with that. He may bludgeon her with that. He should not, but he may because he's insecure. So he may emphasize his leadership to get what he wants out of it. And let me tell you, he's not leading the way Paul said to lead in Ephesians 5. If a man takes advantage of this position, he doesn't understand. He's abusing to lead. This is servant leadership. It is leadership in order to provide for the wife and the children the things that they need. He becomes a servant to the family in that leadership God has given to him. So a confident and wise husband who, yes, has leadership responsibility, will ask for his wife's advice, and he's a fool if he doesn't. He is not all-knowing. There's only one that's omniscient, and he's up there. So a man who is wise will seek out his wife's guidance, her views, her thoughts, her feelings, her opinions. He'll listen to her. He'll consider her needs, because her needs may be very different than his needs. But he's perceptive, and he's watching, and he's trying to understand his wife, just like we said it's important for a wife to understand her husband. And so when you think about this in a broader context, wisdom, not weakness, seeks out the wife's input. This is not an autocracy. This is not forcing one's views and opinions on your wife. And so we said, well, a cabinet is no reflection on a president's authority. He can't be knowledgeable about every facet of how a government operates. And so he has a cabinet. He has people that are entrusted with various elements of how government functions. And so a president having a cabinet is no infringement upon his leadership authority. CEOs need a board of directors. Head coaches need assistant coaches. Generals need sergeants and lieutenants and privates. And so this is the way of the world. No man is an island. Nobody stands completely independent and says, I don't need anybody. I'll lead the organization all on my own. That is a fool. That is a foolish leader. That is a man that does not understand what it means to be a leader. And that's not the way a husband should act. A husband should take on this role that God has given to him with humility and joy and sense of responsibility toward his wife, considering her needs so that he's helping her get to heaven and using the authority God has given him for godly ends. And then finally, we note there that a woman that attacks her own husband does so at her own expense. Every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands. That foolish woman is the woman who doesn't understand or accept that God has given the man a leadership role, and she needs to help him in that and support him in that and accept the role that God has given to her. So when a man enters marriage, point number 3 in our outline, he's stepping into a whole new world. His individual pursuits of amusement, pleasure, self-gratification yield to the concern of those who will be dependent on him. So you envision a young man with sort of the world at his feet, and he's got all these interests, and he loves doing things with that sort of maverick spirit and the spirit of exploration, and I can go where I want and do what I want. But then you enter into marriage, and all of that changes. It's no longer you, it's the two of you. And then perhaps more than that, if children come along. And so your employment is no longer just to exercise personal ambition or climb the corporate ladder. It's now about feeding and housing and clothing your dependents. And this is what you take on as a man. You sacrifice that complete independence, that freedom to go where you want to go, do what you want to do, when you want to do it. You say, there are other blessings and advantages in a marital relationship that I want to take on. And in doing that, I now am responsible to let go of some of these strong, fierce, independent things that perhaps I enjoy doing. It doesn't mean that a man can't do anything that he enjoys doing. That may be a There are some wives that want to encourage their husbands to feel that way, but that's not wise. But it is a mutual relationship. It is now us. I now have to consider what needs are brought into my world now by my wife and then perhaps my children further down the road. A man cannot enter into this relationship and make the promises that you make during a wedding ceremony and then just walk away and abandon a family. I mean, it's done, but you can't do it without paying a price. You're going to have to answer to God, and you're going to have to be able to look in a mirror. And there are men that do horrible things to their wives and children, and they don't support them, and they don't lead properly, and they don't provide for them. They're emotionally distant. They act like their family's an imposition on them, and then they find someone prettier, younger, with more money or better position at work or whatever, and they fall in love with that person and walk away from their family. Well, you can do it, but that's going to create a lot of damage both in the family and to the man that does it. I have seen this in my life, sadly, more than once. And I've seen men pay a very high price because deep down inside they know that they're not being true to themselves, they're not being true to God, and yet they're overwhelmed by carnal and physical thinking. When you take on this role as a man, as a husband and a father, you bear a heavy responsibility before God to serve your family and to serve your wife. You have a lot on your shoulders, and this is a responsibility that will define the rest of your life. Your children won't always be home, but as long as you're living and they're living, you'll be a dad. You'll be a father. You won't be in the same kind of relationship as when your children were at home and dependent on you. But then beyond that, you'll be a husband. If your wife continues to live and you continue to live, you'll be a husband for a long, long time to come. These are issues, these are relationships that change our lives drastically, and we've got to be mature enough to handle that. We've got to be understanding of what that means before we walk in to marriage and we say, I do. We better make sure we can. Well, there are certain other things here in the notes. I'm going to bypass some of this for the sake of our time, but you can read what we have here. Point C, the most important consideration in all of this is the spiritual outcome. It's not the house we can buy. It's not the car we can drive. It's not status in this world. The most important thing in all of this and being a husband and father really is spiritual. And so we're talking about attitudes, and I want to ask we men some very serious questions and brutally honest questions. So one is, men, how many of us see ourselves as the spiritual leaders of our home? Do you see yourself and do you take seriously the responsibility of being the spiritual leader in your home? Are we setting a course that will give our family the best chance of getting to heaven? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean doing all the Bible lessons with the children, although involvement in that is extremely important. Do we have the spiritual vision, though, that provides the guidance and the training and the Bible knowledge that they need? Are we developing an atmosphere in our families of unquestioned attendance at worship? This is what we do. This is where we are on Sunday. No questions, no debates. There's just simply not a doubt as to where we are when the church meets. We're with our brethren. Are we working to make faith in God a happy, positive element in life? Not a drudgery, but a happy, positive thing. We want to worship God. We want to study God's word. We love God. This is what we live for. Are we creating that atmosphere? Are you spiritual dead weight in your family, men? Are you spiritual dead weight? Is your wife pulling the load? Are your children more interested in studying the Bible than you are? Worse yet, is your wife as weak as you? And nobody's really pulling the load, but yet you're not willing to take the reins and lead. These are hard questions. They're penetrating and insightful questions. And answering them honestly might be very, very painful, but this is what God lays on our shoulders, men, when we take on marriage and family responsibilities. Well, let's go on down. You can finish reading some of the notes that we have here. I apologize for not sending these out to this afternoon. I have to talk to my scheduler about that. Questions for discussion down at the bottom, and I wish, again, we could be together discussing these because it's not so fun listening to what I think. Question number 1, discuss aspects of leadership which men think women may not fully understand. You know, sometimes when we look at somebody else from the outside, we might assume a lot. Oh, well, if I were in their shoes, I would do so-and-so. I don't know why they did that way. And it may be the more you learn about what was done or a decision made or an action that was taken, you might realize, oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't know that was going on. I didn't know they were having to think about this and that and that and that, and then put all that together and then make a decision. So looking from the outside in, we can have blinders on and not really see clearly. Well, what aspects? Number 1, I just put down some things that occurred to me. Pressure and stress. Do you really know, ladies, what kind of pressure your husband is under as the leader of the family? I mean, the feminist element wants to portray this as privilege. Oh, power means privilege, having authority. Yeah, you're the head. That means you get to do everything for yourself. That's not what that means. And any man that's conscientious is going to feel the stress and the pressure of leading. It's something that can escape others that are not in that situation. Because like I said a moment ago, you're taking these roles on for life. And your concern for the welfare of your children won't end when they leave home. Your concern for the welfare of your wife won't end when you get into your 50s or 60s. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of stress. The need for encouragement was my second one, the need for encouragement. Men aren't generally as emotionally open as women. It can be easy then for a woman to conclude that her husband doesn't need encouragement. Well, I don't see that he's down or discouraged. He just kind of keeps plowing ahead. And you kind of come to expect that's what your husband is. And I'm telling you, husbands need a pat on the back. They need a good word. They need a thank you. They need a word of appreciation for what is being done day in and day out. Also put down complexity. It is a complex thing to be a husband and a father in this day and time. And I alluded to that earlier. We live in a very complicated world. And right now we live in a very volatile world in terms of saying or doing the wrong thing at your job and perhaps getting fired when you didn't have any ill intention about something you said. But there's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. There's a lot of complexity in running a household and helping your children negotiate their earlier years. I wrote down the energy that it takes to lead. I think this is something that, again, if you're not in the situation, you don't understand the stress, the pressure, the mental pressure. It's not physical, it's mental. The energy that it takes day in and day out to get up, go to work, deal with those issues, come home, deal with the issues that are at home. And then I just put job, family, and church. I mean, there's a lot of different elements that all come into play here that it just might be easy to overlook and think that perhaps a man not being as expressive usually as women are, that he's fine, that he's totally fine. He doesn't really feel the stresses and the pressures. Perhaps it's a matter of difference between what a man shows, what a woman shows. She wears her feelings more on her sleeve. She wants to talk things out. Men tend to close up and keep things in. They don't want to appear to be weak, whatever it may be. I think it's just easy for a woman in the family, a wife and a mother, and especially the children, that children probably don't have any clue what dad's going through. But he could use a pat on the back and a word of appreciation every once in a while. Question number 2, discuss what women need to see in their husbands pertaining to leadership. Well, I would say, first of all, initiative and being proactive. In other words, dads and husbands, don't be a boat anchor. Don't be the last one to think of something or to be drug along by the family. You be out there in front. Lead like the shepherd that goes before the sheep and the sheep follow. Be the one to take initiative. Be the one to come up with ideas. Be the one that's sort of the driving force spiritually in the family. I also put down real dedication. Not something you're just trying to phone in, not something you're trying to fake, or the family's just sort of a happy nuisance. But no, I'm really dedicated to this. I'm really on board here. I am actively involved, which may mean putting your cell phone down, may mean giving your full attention to what's going on, putting a puzzle together, reading a book, playing with Legos or whatever it may be. I'm engaged. I'm fully dedicated to what's happening here in my family. A woman might need to see self-sacrifice in her husband, that he's really willing to give up something that he might otherwise want to do, but the family calls. Family duties are waiting on him. I think a wife wants to see help and service from the husband, and however that may come in the family. But husbands, I think there are things that we can do to know. I mean, it's not a matter of obligation, but it just may be courtesy. Unloading a dishwasher, or, putting the sheets on the bed after they've been washed, or cleaning up after yourself, whatever it may be. I think a wife is heartened by a man who steps a little bit outside, perhaps, of his role and says, honey, let me help you with that. If it's in our household, honey doesn't like the way you load the dishwasher, but we won't go down that road. Gentleness. It may be that a wife appreciates gentleness in her husband, that he's showing a softer side, not a feminine side, but an appreciation for his wife, a sensitivity toward her needs, that he's approachable, that she can open up, she can talk, she'll have a gentle response. Various other things, creativity and energy in the family. Again, I'm engaged. I'm a part of what's going on. It's not we're dragging dad along, but dad's really part of this whole experience. Humility and not overconfidence. Being a leader doesn't mean that you never have a self-doubt, that you never show any weakness. You just plow ahead, storm the hill. That's not what it means to be a leader. You've got to show the reality of who you are. And sometimes that means insecurity. You're not sure how this is going to go. You're not sure what decision to make. We're warned over and over in Scripture about thinking too highly of ourselves. And so this is where a man in his humility might need to say, honey, what do you think we ought to do? Again, a man's a fool if he doesn't ask that question of his wife, especially at crucial moments along the way when there's a fork in the road. Honey, what do you think? And not just what do you want to do, honey, but what do you think? If we do A, what do you think is going to result from that? If we do B, what do you think is going to result from that? Should we go C instead? What do you think, dear? Let's talk this out. Let's work this out. It takes humility to do that. But it's humility and wisdom that enables a man to really be the kind of leader his wife is going to respond to. And to that end, I put the ability to admit mistakes and state his need for support. I didn't do that very well. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Boy, that was a bad judgment on my part. And, help me recover from this. Let's move forward. Well, there's lots of other things to add into that. Our time is getting short. How can husbands and fathers take a leading role in setting a spiritual tone for the family? So very quickly, I put focus on spiritual activities. Don't just be the sports and recreation leader in your family. You're more than a gym teacher, and you're more than a coach, Dad. Focus on spiritual activities. What do my children need to help build them up spiritually? And then I wrote enthusiasm for worship. You be the one that's out ready to go when it's time to go. You're not the one still upstairs and the family's down by the door and they're waiting on dad, and dad kind of, rolling his eyes and coming down the steps. No, be the leader. Take the initiative. Be enthusiastic. Be the one that's saying, I'm so glad it's Sunday. Let's go to church. Let's be around our brethren, especially now when we're together so infrequently because of COVID. But, before COVID hit, were you enthusiastic? And could your family sense that? Because if you weren't, they can sense that too. If dad's not really on board, they'll sense it. They'll know. You can't fake spirituality. And children have spirituality detectors, and they have wisdom detectors. They have involvement detectors. I mean, your children know what you're doing. And we're not going to fool our kids. We may think we will, but we're not going to fool our kids. Involvement in Bible studies, we touched on that earlier. Association with other Christians. Do you like being with other Christians? Do you like having people in your home? Do you like going out to eat with folks? Do you like coming to potlucks? Do you like other opportunities that we have to be together? Are these the people of your choice that you want to associate with? And then I put just participation. Men, are you a participant, both publicly and privately, but saying prayers, teaching classes, if you can, lead the singing, whatever it may be. Do your children see you as actively involved? Or do they see you sit back? Oh, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to lead a prayer. I might say something wrong. I don't want to teach a class. That's too much work. Somebody can do it, better than I can. I mean, there's a million things we can say, but none of them really work. We need to be involved. We need to be energetic. We need to be proactive. We need to be real. We need to be genuine. We need to be leaders. We need to be leaders. And if we're doing all those things as best we can and not phoning it in and not pretending to be something we're not, then our wives and our children are going to have the best chance to go to heaven. We can't guarantee it. Everybody's got free will. Our wives have free will, our children. But, we're charged with leading and guiding and being the head of our family. And that takes being a man as God defines a man. And I hope we've encouraged that in the study that we've had tonight. Not politically correct. You're not going to hear this in many places in any kind of public forum, but they're crucial things for us to talk about, think about, and put into practice in our lives. I hope it's helped to that end. Thanks for joining in our study, and have a good rest of the week.